Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to our Thursday 12 noon webinar. And today we are going to focus on the government's economic recovery plan. It's going to be discussed by Parliament in the next 2 hours or so, and the President will be unveiling this plan. It has been workshopped many times from NADLEC to Cabinet Lekgotla, and now being taken to the South African parliamentarians. But we more or less know what is likely to be contained in this recovery plan. South Africa already in trouble on so many fronts: contracting economy and rising unemployment and salaries that are low, high inequality levels, corruption, municipalities that are not functional. But at the end of the day, we've got to make this economy work. And I invited 3 people to come and share with us their thoughts on how we can help make this recovery plan work. And Busi Sibeko is with me. She is an economist with the Institute for Economic Justice, and she is going to share with us the thinking from the IEJ. We'll also be joined by Lukhanyo Mnguni, who is an academic and analyst at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we also expect to be joined by Vusi Thembekwayo, who is a businessman as well as venture capitalist. So we've got a broad range of views here. The intention is to look at the elements in the recovery plan that we may know something about and whether they will work or not, and also look at how best to take South Africa forward. And I'm pleased that, at least compared to me, my panelists are younger than me, so they are the ones who should dominate the views and the conversation this afternoon. Busi, thank you very much for joining us and welcome.
Hi, thank you. And I think those.
I've got Lukhanyo Mnguni also joining us. Lukhanyo, thank you very much for joining us. Can you hear us? No, not yet. He cannot. But Busi, you go first. The recovery plan. What do you expect from it? Just give me 3 takeaway issues that to you would indicate that indeed it is a well thought through document and that indeed it might work to mitigate the trouble that we're in already.
Thank you very much for that question. And in fact, you read my mind, because there's 3 broad categories in which I think about this recovery plan. The first is that we need to stimulate. We need economic measures that will rescue the economy in the short run. And there is a pending humanitarian crisis when the absence of the extension of the currently existing grants, 5.8 million people will be plunged into destitution and hunger. So that's the first, stimulate. 2, we need to stabilize. We need to boost domestic demand and develop long-term supply capacity, which means we need to take care of households and businesses. And this also includes a revision of macroeconomic policy generally. We need to think about how can we change our macroeconomic policy in order to stabilize, but also for the long run. And 3, structural transformation. It is critical that we begin to shape and change our economy as it is currently designed. And I'm not talking about structural transformation in the narrow ways that economists usually talk about it. I am talking about developing a green and purple economy, and purple economy is talking really about the care economy, which is critical. And so just to wrap up, to say, after the Great Depression, or while there was the Great Depression in the United States, they also had a similar framework, and it was called the 3 R's, and it was relief, recovery, and reform. And these are new words, but to say these are the 3 elements that I think we need for this economic recovery to work.
All right, Lukhanyo, I hope you can hear us now, and welcome if you can. Lukhanyo? You can or you can't? Well, as would happen with these things, unfortunately, he cannot hear us. But then, looking at what government has attempted to do in recent times, and of course, we didn't just get here accidentally. As one commentator said, that we should not be fooled into thinking that we are in this predicament because of the COVID-19 lockdowns. It is something that has been happening anyway over a long period of time, more than 10 years. That is what is being referred to. But in recent times, we've had the Job Summit, we've had the Investment Summit, we've had the Infrastructure Summit, and we've had other things. We've got the National Development Plan. Where, to your mind, do you think all of these things fit in? And you know, sometimes when I discuss these things, I understand the theory, I understand the policies around it, I understand the summits around it, but I look at it from the point of view of the people who should be impacted by this. And I'll use the example of an unemployed person. That at what point would such a person know that indeed this works for me, you think, Busi?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it is very evident that COVID-19 is exacerbating the current crisis. I mean, we cannot forget that coming into this crisis, we were already in a recession, and in fact, we've had long periods of low growth, and you know, our economy is not structurally transforming; it's not changing in its infrastructure itself, and so. I love that you mentioned the job summits, because I think one of the pending conversations from that summit itself was that we need to change our macroeconomic framework. And we haven't seen much of that. We need a macroeconomic framework, right? And the current frameworks that we're implementing have not yielded that. And so just to say, I think, you know, when we are in this moment, it's difficult, and that's why we need immediate relief almost, right? We need an emergency rescue package, and right now I haven't seen much about that, but we'll have to see in the details. But if we can implement an immediate economic rescue package that works, so not like the one we've seen where not everyone has received the grants for unemployment. If we can administer an actual economic response package, then we'll know that it is working and that we're going in the right direction. So let's see what is tabled around the immediate run.
Okay, well, let me just interrupt you there for a moment. You say you are persuaded along the lines of relief, recovery, and what is reform, as you called it. Now, Lukhanyo, welcome, and I hope you can hear us now. What do you think will be the three most important things to come out of the recovery plan that you think will give you a sense that we are headed the right direction in fixing the economy?
No, thanks. I'm hopeful that I'm audible now.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead and welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. I think the first one is just something that we've been working on, some of us, during the lockdown, and making some proposals to the National Command Council, Coronavirus Command Council, around what we call the precariat. Those are people who are generally vulnerable in unsecure employment in the informal sector, and with the job losses, there's going to be greater participation in the informal economy. So what I'm trying to say is that I'll be looking out to check how the president articulates imagination of the informal economy. Because one of the problems in South Africa is that we've got a lot of formalization. So there's a lot of reliance on, you know, registered business, compliant in this sense, in terms of your SARS documents, in terms of your CIPC and so on. And yet the reality is that almost 20 million people are part of the precariat in this country. And so you've got to reimagine the informal economy. It's the only category, by the way, as Busi is talking about, you know, not everybody has been benefiting from the funds. The informal economy participants didn't benefit from any relief package. And it was so difficult for them to be imagined in the ecosystem of relief. And I think that has really crippled a lot of households, because one, you will find that they are not fully qualifying for the 350 rands COVID grant relief. They are not fully qualifying for anything from the UIF. There is no package that is there to cushion the informal economy. There's nobody who's going to help them jumpstart their businesses. You will know, Tim, that it took a lot of lobbying, even during the start of lockdown, for the informal economy that is selling in the food space to be brought back to activity. And there were all those forms of permits they needed to reapply for. We saw the scrap metal collectors and the minister involved there, Barbara Creasy, having to be pushed to try and say, how do you secure these people who do a lot of work in terms of recycling and so on, who were locked out because of the lockdown. So I'm looking personally, how do you imagine the informal economy? Because that's going to be the heartbeat of our economy for some time, as people lose jobs in the formal sector. So how do you make sure that police don't just go around arresting people arbitrarily who are trying to make a living? How do you put a moratorium on some of these nonsensical bylaws that municipalities, particularly metropolitan municipalities, implement in terms of viewing the informal economy as a dirty economy. I think in terms of the macroeconomic issues that I mean, for me, it's the reimagination of infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, what are we talking about? Because we've had this thing as a buzzword, invest in infrastructure to jumpstart the economy. But it's only infrastructure that forms the basis of future economic activity that is going to help us jumpstart the economy, not infrastructure that is for cars, expanding highways that are already too big anyway. What about public transport? I mean, we've been investing every 3 years about 600 to 800 million every 3 years since President Jacob Zuma took over and started the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Council. But we don't see any value of that infrastructure in terms of planning for people, because that's what is important. Get people to work safely, economically, and on time, so that I can also sell my car if I want to and make savings from the money that I'm spending on the car and be able to benefit by spending into other areas of the economy. So for me, I'm looking for a different imagination as well when we talk about infrastructure. Let me leave it at that for now.
All right, thanks very much. And let me bring in Vusi Thembekwayo. Vusi, welcome, and a pleasure to have you with us as well. For you, tell me, Vusi, what do you think? I want us to set the agenda first before we go into the detail of how things must be implemented. For you, Vusi, what do you think are the 3 key things that will convince you that this time around government has got it all together when they talk about the economic recovery plan, that will convince you that they have thought this plan through and that indeed it hopefully will work in time?
The first and most important is if we can see a public sector wage discussion that not only is about freezing, but also lowering the public sector. The truth is that our public sector is massively bloated, it's overstaffed, and it's lethargic, right? So, and what you need is you need a head at the table that's willing to take the tough decisions. And if we continue to move away from having that conversation because it's unpopular with Labour or unpopular with some of the partners in the tripartite alliance, in my mind, it just goes to show that we're not serious about the crisis that we are in. The second is going to be a real discussion about what is the role of banks in enabling a South Africa that is growing. We can't continue with this conversation where our banks operating in South Africa think they're operating in Switzerland, right? So their credit models and their risk rating models and how they deploy and enable economic activity continues to mirror a first world economic environment when it's pretty clear that's not where we are. It's very, very clear, right? And so if we don't tackle, in my mind, those 2 things, how do you enable a capital flow system which is driven by the banks, that is liberalized and that is fair and equitable to South Africans, as well as how do you rethink the structure of government and whether or not that structure of government is agile, nimble, and responsive to not only where the country is, but also to the needs of the country. If we can't do that, then I'm afraid this is going to be another plan which is very well written. It'll have very many good conferences. Myself, Busi, Lukhanyo will be there and we'll speak, and but nothing material will come of it.
Let me invite our attendees to also make their contributions or raise questions. If you are listening to Busi Sibeko, Lukhanyo Mnguni, and Vusi Thembekwayo, and you too want to make an input, please feel free to do so. After all, it's your recovery plan as well, as much as it was hammered out somewhere else where you and I did not take place. And it is deliberate on my part to have this discussion to say we too must have a voice and make inputs on how this country should be run. But as indicated earlier on, Busi, that this is not new. The fact that we are in an economic situation that we find ourselves in with the highest unemployment rate in the world, the contracting economic growth, and the backlogs in infrastructure, and so it goes. The constraints that you see in the system that have been coming along for some time now, how do we break through those constraints? If you can identify them and tell me how we break through that and we solve them. I mean, there are problems in so many different places, right? You mentioned SOEs, you can mention municipalities, you can mention capacity care. Take your pick and tell me, how do we overcome those?
No, that's an important question, and I think I want to start by saying that we need to reimagine macroeconomic policy, and that's the area that I'm coming from. I've been called business averse, so now I begin by laying that my work is really around government involvement, and to say we need to reimagine our macroeconomic policy, and we need to meet people's material needs. Which is why I'm hammering so much around what we need to do right now. That is a constraint, right? When we're going to have 6 million people be plunged into destitution and hunger, that's going to be a constraint. But really, ultimately, I think the biggest constraint in our economy is that we are applying neoliberal economic policies, which have systematically not worked since 1994. We are not seeing trickle-down effects. We are not seeing what we were promised with this beautiful neoliberal dream, and which is why I say that, you know, the macroeconomic policy itself needs reimagining, and that's still a pending discussion, even from the Jobs Summit. We should already have a pro-employment macroeconomic policy plan. And to say that, and I like that Lukhanyo raised the issue of infrastructure, because something that continuously comes up for me is that we need care infrastructure in our economy, because disproportionately women are overburdened with care work. So how do we move towards an economy that's purple or care work aware? Is that we need to remove ourselves or detach ourselves, and I think that's one of the major constraints, detach ourselves from the status quo, from the macroeconomic policy that tends to privatize, liberalize, rationalize, and that's what neoliberal economics is about. And so,
but you know, Busi, if I may come in there, I'm wondering when we talk, and I want to put the same to look on at this question about infrastructure. That we talk about it as if it's I'm not blaming you or him, as if it's a new idea, right? Infrastructure has always been there on the agenda, and we know water has got to be supplied, provided, for instance, right? And many communities are still waiting for such water to be delivered. There have been plans to build dams. Those dams have not been built yet. There's water that has to be reticulated to communities, Madibeng and Kwakwa and elsewhere. That has not happened. Now, I wonder, we're talking about a recovery plan and presenting it magically, somehow make those dams appear when they should have been built long time ago, and we should just be building on them. And we know, of course, what's happened to what is happening to the railway infrastructure. Trains that used to run are not running as we speak.
Absolutely.
But you can come in as well if you want to comment. Vusi, if you want to comment to that question, but Busi, you go first.
Yes, so I think that you raise a very important question, and it's a question around state capacity and corruption, which are emerging topics, even with this supplementary budget that has been introduced. Those are key issues that are emerging. But I think one of the things we sometimes, and why I say we need to reimagine, so in the United States currently, they're thinking about fiscal stimulus policies that are coupled with anti-corruption strategies. So thinking about expenditure beyond just, you know, this is the money allocation. It's about how do we implement this quickly and get it to the people. So for instance, we said implement a universal basic income grant, right? And one of the reasons for that is because you can have one system that is more streamlined and gets the money to all the people, right? If everyone just has to present an ID, you know, you don't have this criteria that's excluding people or thinking through all those things, then we need to almost create new, and I don't want to use the word infrastructure, but you need to create new strategies through which you implement these things and in their design itself. And so in this economic recovery strategy, I think it would be great, right, if we saw that they said, we've thought about infrastructure and this is how it will be done differently. But the problem is that we are always harping on structural reform. And the thing about structural reform is that it assumes that what you've been doing is almost correct and just needs to be done better. And that's why I'm saying we need to reimagine completely. So that's what I would love to see. I don't know what extent we'll see that.
And Vusi, you can comment on this question. I've got two questions for you on top of you adding your voice on the infrastructure question. And one is, how do you cut the wage bill of the government? Where would you start? And secondly, how would you reform the way the banking system works in South Africa? How would it work differently? You suggested that it should be done differently to what happens let's say in Switzerland or in Europe, somewhere, that it should be adapted for South African conditions. How would you do it differently?
So first, let me just say that one of the dangers, and Tim, you'll excuse me, you and I have had the privilege of sharing ideas across the table a couple of times over the years.
Yes.
So if you allow me, I'll be candid. One of the dangers of South Africa is we love talking about new things as if the new things are the panacea to our problems. So I'm old enough to remember when we were talking about gear and we were all at economic conferences and gear was the policy. Then Asgisa was the policy. Then it became the new growth path, then the national development plan. And I think we have a responsibility as South Africans to stop letting the people who are coming up with the acronyms set the agenda. This is persistently why we are finding ourselves commenting on an agenda that we didn't set. So all of a sudden, I'm hearing infrastructure everywhere I turn. First of all, this conversation about infrastructure is not new. Any person that did Economics 101 knows all about the Marshall Plan and how that really is what brought Europe out of the trouble that it was in, and it fueled the economic growth that the US is in. So this discussion isn't new, but here's what people are not telling you. It can't be infrastructure for infrastructure's sake. So it has to be infrastructure that is an economic multiplier. So for instance, this is a deeply unpopular view, but here is a fact. Social infrastructure is important infrastructure, but it's not an economic multiplier. Now, I challenge anybody in this conversation to go and look at what was touted as the first draft of that infrastructure program and have a look at how many social infrastructure development programs are in there. With respect, building homes for the poor is a very important thing that must be prioritized. But let's not treat building homes for the poor, which is a social infrastructure program, like it's going to be an economic multiplier, because it isn't. And we must be clear about that, and we need to be honest about that, so that if we're constructing an infrastructure-based economic recovery plan, it's an infrastructure-based economic recovery plan, and we are clear where the levers of growth are. So what I'm saying is, let's just be honest with ourselves, guys. We can lie to the rest of the world, but let's be honest with ourselves about where we are. So I think that's the first thing to make. You asked the question about reducing government. I think the place to actually start is just look at provinces. You know, in business, Tim, here's what we do. If I buy a company that is an ailing company, and this is a case study for South Africa. So in my daily work, what I do is I look for ailing assets that are performing beneath their potential, and I turn them around. Classic South Africa case study. So here in South Africa, what you have is a country that is performing, if it was a listed asset, below NAV, net asset value. So what are the things I would do to turn it around? One of the first things you do is you reduce middle management. So you have to reduce the size of provinces. In fact, you have to think about whether or not you need provinces in the first place. The second thing you do is you take your best talent and you put them closest to the customer. So all of these very well-paid, highly paid government technocrats sitting in Pretoria should actually be sitting in municipalities where the action happens. Why do we need so many chief directors in all of these large national departments, whose job it is to receive a paper on the in tray, read it, edit it, and put it on the out tray for somebody else to receive, right? So if you don't deal with where you're allocating talent, you can't deal with whether or not service delivery actually happens on the ground. And that means the taxpayer is paying, but they're not getting the return because the performance is the distortion in terms of what they're getting. Then you ask the question about reforming banks. And I'd like to think my feedback is balanced here. But the truth is this. South African banks love going on global conferences, and I've been at some of them, where they talk about how well they manage risk. Now, Tim, not taking a risk is also a risk management strategy. That's so we are clear. So if somebody says, how do you manage risk? And you say, just don't take it. That's also a risk management strategy. And that, by the way, seems to be the default position of many of our banks. I'll give you a very quick example. So we had this loan guarantee scheme, this LGS that was promulgated as part of the COVID stimulation package. 500 billion, we were told. Minister Mnguni then went into the press conference and said, actually, it's closer to 800 billion. Well, what are the facts? Of the 500 billion, 200 billion was allocated through the banks as part of the loan guarantee scheme. I was one of the people who said, don't give this money to banks to disperse. Very simple reason why. What the banks will do is they'll take the capital, shore up their balance sheet, and they'll take the least risk and give the money to the clients who need it the least. What's happened since? Of the 200 billion, that last count, of I think it was 67 billion that was actually allocated to businesses. 75% of them were white businesses, most of whom were the least risky clients for banks. So just so we're clear, a government-backed, treasury-backed loan guarantee scheme not only was not pushed out into the market, but that which was pushed out into the market went to the clients that needed it the least. In exactly the same time, our economy shed 2.2 million jobs. So
on top of jobs that were already
about.
Sure, and I'm saying on top of the high unemployment rate that existed anyway. So it's more than what, 10 million people, 12 million people that are without jobs as we speak.
People now. 13
exactly.
million people in South Africa.
And hopefully, you know, this would send them back. I don't know. We talk about it all the time. The numbers are there. Stats SA tells us, everybody knows. But sometimes and somehow we don't regard this as an emergency. Lukhanyo, Mnguni, I'm not sure. I'm not seeing you. I'm not sure if you're still on the panel. Or
I am with you. I'm with you. I'm not sure what has happened to my video.
Yeah, we can't see you, and that's why I was not bringing you in on the conversation. I couldn't see you, but be that as it may, go ahead.
I can hear you quite well.
Yeah, tell me about the constraints that you see that you think should be dealt with immediately if we are going to make a difference. We've had Busi and Vusi speak passionately about what they see happening in the system that they think and believe can be sorted out almost right away.
Well, the biggest constraint is going to be, where does the money come from? Where are you going to get the money? We can talk about all the plans in terms of what needs to happen and what is the low-hanging fruit in our macroeconomic framework where we can get the money. I mean, there is a big debate in South Africa that even the former States General now, Dr. Padi Lehuta, has come back to this question around the Reserve Bank and it needing to be much more activist in helping us navigate these treacherous waters we find ourselves in because of COVID-19. Now, economists like Makubule have written up on this, Chris Malikane and them, and there's always been pushback from Treasury and particularly from the Minister of Finance insofar as imagining the place of the Reserve Bank, particularly what some people might call it printing money for government, which is really a form of quantitative easing, as to how can the Reserve Bank avail in real time significant amounts of money to the economy so that we are in a better fiscal position, because our fiscal position is very difficult because our GDP has been contracting for a while, even before COVID. We were already talking about another technical recession and our borrowing has been increasing. So our debt to GDP is looking very dire. And the problem is not necessarily the debt, it's your inability to service that debt that is a problem. So if you are accumulating lots of debt, but your GDP was also increasing, you'd be in a better position to manage your.
I want to take a few comments from the attendees, but to raise an issue with you, because Vusi put it on the table saying that reduce the wage bill of the government, because on one hand, borrowing is continue to increase. We know it's what, 21% of the total budget will be going towards servicing the very debt, right? And the wage bill is at 60%. So already you've lost what, 81% is out of the budget, and you're left with 19% to do all kinds of wonderful things that we all say should happen. So he's arguing or making the point that reduce the wage bill is giving his ideas. For you, do you think it's a good idea? And if you were to reduce the wage bill, where would you start? How would you go about it?
It's a good idea, but it's a very political hotbed, right? And I mean, if you're talking about provinces, which I fully agree with him, I've made this argument for years now that you don't need provinces. And I think now that we are talking about electoral reforms, we are going to be able to have that conversation properly and probably push for it. But it would need certain constitutional amendments, certain legislative amendments. So it's something that's down the line. You are very lucky if you have 19%, by the way, for service delivery. If you are in a department like education in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, 81% of their budget goes to personnel and incentives and all of those things. Only 9% is left for service delivery. So yes, you do have these bloated administrations across. I mean, you get DDGs, chief director, assistant director, and it's quite amazing when you hear these titles, because it really showcases the problem. Why are so many people needed to carry out certain tasks? But I think we've seen, I mean, with SAA, what the business rescue practitioners have done with voluntary packages for people to retire and so on. You probably need a bigger push on that. And I know Minister of Finance had started that conversation earlier this year, a bigger push for people to retire, but a bigger push to reconfigure, to say, how do you get government, the bureaucracy, working smarter? I mean, take questions of procurement. How do you make procurement easier? How do you insulate procurement, as Busi was saying, have an anti-corruption strategy to this money that we are talking about that is needed to stimulate this economy? Because without that, unfortunately, so without a clear anti-corruption strategy, without a clear reframing of procurement where people can't just easily balloon prices for services. And I've always said that in all these services that are constitutional rights, so what we call socio-economic rights, I think there should be something in our procurement framework that says you're not delivering those for purposes of making profit. Because as Busi says, I mean, they are not economic multipliers, but you could also decrease the value of delivery for those services. Housing, I mean, you might say this is far-fetched. I've said government uses bricks so much. You've got 50 TVET colleges in this country. Why can't those colleges make the bricks for government to actually build houses? Because you would be decreasing the input cost of delivery of some of these socio-economic rights. Unfortunately, we have a government, I think, whose vision and ability to tackle some of these politically hot issues is not there. There's no political will to deal with it.
I wanted to talk about a few points, and I will raise them. The one is the expropriation bill, the expropriation of land and property without compensation, and couple it with mining rights, for instance, how they are managed and what has happened there. It's an important sector in the economy. And I mean, and land speaks to agriculture and other parts of the economy. But Alex, your question about banks, I think Vusi has responded to that. And Tumbedzo, you say South Africa has never been short of plans. We've had many. The issue is implementation, and for as long as decisions are made with the intention of balancing powers, which you said, Lukhanyo, is the problem in South Africa, then he says we're going nowhere. And you, in a way, are acknowledging the fact, because the political forces and issues are not going to go away. They are there. Actually, they're going to have more say than any of us will ever have. Zimazi Mabet says infrastructure rollout programs are by definition expansionary. How could we be thinking of an expansionary budget when the fiscus is as stretched as it is? Are we not building pies in the sky? Where's the money going to? Show me the money. Talk the project, yes, show me the money. And of course, the ability to deliver. I always like to go back to the water issues. You know, I really personally cannot understand, not for 1 minute, why it is not possible for us to deliver water when the budgets are allocated and years go by, communities live without water. Not even for new money, but money that was allocated already in the past. Please hold on to that thought. I'm going to Andre van Rooyen, who wants to know about lowering BEE regulations, as well as reforming labor laws and unions to open the market. Busi, you go first on those 2 points.
And those are actually, well, there's so many things to comment on. I think, no, I agree that, like I've already said, that state capacity remains a key issue, and which is why actually bringing back this wage bill discussion is that we need to have a more nuanced discussion about why is the wage bill the way it is, and then look at the implementation, right? And the reason why I always come back to this, to the structure of the wage bill itself is because, like we're saying, provinces, a lot of the expenditure is on teachers, right? But the teacher to student ratio is still high, right? And so we need to think about what is the cost of delivering human rights in South Africa, actually? And I think that analysis has not been done. And in fact, we need to think about in terms of the structure of the wage bill. When you look at the healthcare sector, there's 38,000 vacant posts as of 2018, right? So when we talk about cutting the wage bill in terms of an absolute number, it misses actually some of these critical discussions that we need to be having, right? So when we analyze the access to water and delivery of water, right, we need to be talking about some of these things, about who's there, who's the structure, who's working on what capacities and resources exist. And another key issue that I want to throw on the table is the issue of underspend, right? So not all of it is always that departments are not just spending money, but sometimes it happens that we need resources. So we need to think about how to develop state capacity, which at times requires financing and other times it requires just reform of the actual structure internally. And so when coming back to where is the money, I think that's always the big question. And I love that question because ultimately it really goes back to this question of governments are not like households, and it is critical that we acknowledge that, right? That we're in a crisis, and what is the cost of not doing what we're supposed to do right now to save human lives and livelihoods right now, right? So it's really to say that a well-spent stimulus, which goes back to capacity and so forth, will pay for itself, right? So that's actually how it works in the long term, because not like a household. It's like if you're in a household and you cut your money to go to work, so you don't go to work, right? That's critical expenditure. If you don't go to work and you don't get paid, right? It hurts your finances, if I were to use a household example, but it's not a household, and it is critical that we always go back to this. And debt in itself will be there. And you know, I really just like how people say we will not meet our debt requirements this year, as if South Africa, you know, as if that was a given, because it wasn't really a given at the current state of our economy. That was not a given to begin with. And just to jump on, I had one more thing that I wanted to add, but I'll let this round go. And oh, I remember now. I actually wanted to say that one of the critical things and why I keep harping on this idea of we need to rethink the macroeconomic framework is to say that sometimes we think social expenditure doesn't have high fiscal multipliers, but it does. And in fact, the ITUC has done research that showed that if you invested in health and care sector, you could create just 2% of GDP. If you invested that, you could create more than 400,000 jobs, and would also change the equity, right? Who does unpaid care work? It's women in the households, right? So it is critical that we reimagine, like a study in the United States shows that spending on children has got the highest marginal value in public sector expenditure. So we need to rethink out of this masculine, productive, and not to say that the productive capacities are not important, but we need to break away from the traditional ways in which we think about productive work in itself and where we get high fiscal multipliers, because I don't think in our current economy as it exists, it is given based on what we know from past.
Okay, well, there's the question about lowering BEE regulations from Andre van Rooyen, and Peter Green says, let's stop all the nonsense talk. The economy must be liberalized, free enterprise, the only system that works, and government should not be engaged in any economic activity. Who wants to go on this one? Vusi, Lukhanyo, maybe Vusi.
I'll go first, Tim.
Okay, go. Yeah, sure, go. Yeah.
Because I mean, we hear a lot of this push to undo transformation imperatives as a way of dealing with crisis, as though that business that has failed for 26 years to come to the party on the issue of transformation at a time when they were making serious money. Look at the mining industry during the platinum boom in 2006, 2005, 2007, 2008. Most of the money was being taken back to shareholders as dividends rather than reinvesting in those companies, rather than servicing those social and labor plans. So I think this idea that we must now abandon transformation imperatives so that we get out of crisis is just another in the class hierarchy of things. It's to make sure that those who have the means to fuel production will continue to be protected so that they can treat labor badly, pay workers badly. And this is where we talk about this reform of labor regulations and all of these things, which nobody can ever tell you. I mean, you get some economists who will tell you that those who are currently employed are actually closing out the unemployed because they fight for higher wages, they fight for more incentives for those who are already employed, making it impossible for business to employ new people. But there's no demonstration that business in South Africa has been activist, that business in South Africa has been held accountable. And just to add on some of the ideas that Busi was talking about for banking, if you talk to people who are into social entrepreneurship, they will tell you how in countries like Brazil, banks are actually mandated to use a percentage of government deposits that they hold for funding of SMEs. Because what we have now, we have a problem where there's going to be very limited funding for anything that is new. And what we are starting to see in South Africa is government abandoning its lead role in terms of actually pushing this reform agenda, so that they're now saying the private sector must take lead. They are now talking about syndicating funds with the private sector, blended financing, where government brings 10 billion rands and then the private sector must bring 90 billion rands. And that's a very twisted logic, because I mean, business will say there's no business case for us to be involved, and then you'll struggle to raise the funds and you'll look back. And definitely we need just a last part of what you spoke about, Tim, land, mining rights and agriculture. What do we need to do there? We know that there are a lot of propositions on the table for expropriation without compensation. Questions of mining rights now have changed because of some court outcomes last year, which now give communities a greater say, that communities must give informed consent before mining can start or proceed in certain communities, which some people view it as a burden because it then means greater conversation. But we can't abandon those. We can't then say people no longer have rights to their indigenous land, that people no longer have a say in terms of development imperative. So it's important for us to balance how we emerge out of the crisis, but continue the spirit and the law of our constitution and champion it. And I absolutely agree. There is some form of social expenditure that is important, as Busi is saying, those things that keep people secure, keep them healthy, keep them educated. And also part of this desire for infrastructure, which we keep coming back to this buzzword, when I talk about the reimagination of it, if you could minimize the number of trucks that are on our roads, and you go back to freight rail services, which have been depleted significantly since 1994, which would then decrease your road fatalities, and which would then be a boost to your economy because you would be losing less people. So we also need to think, how do we stop the road carnage? I mean, the number of deaths on our roads is bizarre in South Africa, and it has a material impact on the economy and its viability.
Sure. Guy Harris says, how many SMEs are in the 7-a-side teams versus big business, big government, and big unions? Because whenever we talk about business, I find, especially from government's point of view, it means big business, not necessarily the ordinary entrepreneurs, SMEs, and they're there in their hundreds of thousands. And I think the lockdown decimated the few that remained, right? When we talk unemployment, somehow there's also a view that all the big systems, whether it be government, big organizations are the ones that are going to create that employment. Obviously, we need the business people, the entrepreneurs, to succeed in order to grow so they can create employment. But I find that that's not the thing that we emphasize most of the time. If there are bigger problems experienced in South Africa, I think they're experienced mostly by the risk takers who take the last 2,000. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
So
go ahead.
So one of my it used to be a frustration. Now it's just a source of humor. Is that South African policymakers are chronically schizophrenic. They can't decide what they want South Africa to look like. And so they want to please everybody, and as a consequence, nobody is happy. So here's what I mean. Less than a year ago, every single conference was about the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, robotics, data sciences, etc., etc. No one was talking infrastructure, not as far as I can recall, because that was the buzzword that they went to Davos and they heard, and then they came back to sell us this buzzword. But anybody who works, and I run a VC firm, anybody who works in venture capital will tell you that you can't build a fourth industrial revolutions economy off the back of big business. You build it off the back of enabling what he called IDEs, innovation-driven enterprises, not even SMEs. In our law, there is nothing that talks to IDEs in South Africa. We can't even get the government to pass a startup act, let alone to give us foreign exchange regulations that allow for VC firms to tranche capital in and outside of the country to do early stage VC deals. So the point is this: the conversations were happening at conference, but on the ground, very little was happening. And what happens is we keep getting pulled into the smoke screen of thinking that the conversation is the action. So today we're going to hear a president give us the plan, and that plan will drive a conversation, and we will think the conversation is the action. It won't be. It can't be. And if we don't do anything materially on the ground, nothing is going to change. I have to agree with Lukhanyo on his comment about transformation. I get really frustrated when South Africans think transformation is an impediment to growth. Transformation is not an impediment to growth. It's a ticket price for doing business. Go to Kuala Lumpur and see if you can do business there without adhering to the local rules on indigenization. It's not going to happen, right? The same could be said about many parts of the Middle East. You can say the same about many parts of the Asian tigers. In fact, you can say the same about many parts of the world. If you go there to do business, there are rules to doing business. So we shouldn't even bring this transformation conversation to the table as if it's an impediment to doing business, because it clearly isn't. It's a red herring, and we need to call it out.
I want to bring in Sean Mavunda's views. Sean says Eskom is the single biggest problem that threatens to collapse our economy. Well, they're trying to make things happen, but as we had, more than 5,000 employees at Eskom seemingly are doing business with the very entity, besides the fact that there are other questionable contracts with big companies that are involved in building the power generation plants, and of course the politics of whether to break Eskom into three parts. What is to be done with Eskom actually? Because those who are in charge are proposing ideas of what to do with it, but then the political interests, as we've had earlier on, are opposed to that, and government is tentative on what it intends doing with Eskom. And then what happens? Then we are stuck the same place. A brief comment from you, Busi and Lukhanyo, and then let's move on to the next question.
Thank you. Oh, Busi.
Busi.
Okay. I'm like, I don't know which one. This is not my sectoral expertise, but I do want to mention the things that I believe are critical. The one is that we need to be thinking about how do we create a green economy, and how does Eskom fit into this change into this green economy, the structural transformation thing I was talking about. And I think it is critical that whatever happens with Eskom, that we understand, and there's been a lot of ideas that have been put on the table, but how do we reskill? If we're going to change Eskom, we need to reskill those workers, and a social contract is very important in that way. I think too, it is critical that we decisively deal with Eskom's debt, whatever that looks like, and we've put forward a number of ideas which we can think of. How do you, deal with the finances? I think is critical, because continuously what we're seeing is that Eskom as a contingent liability is actually threatening, and SOEs generally are taking away from our ability to provision other things on the budget. And I think it is important that we find financial ways to resolve these issues. And so those are, I think, my two main thoughts. Sure. But like I said, not really my sectoral expertise.
Well, I just want a brief comment on that, because we will never sort out Eskom here, never. We know it's going to be there for some time.
Can I just, before you jump in, if you will allow me, I just want to make a quick comment on this Eskom thing. Here is the basics that we must agree to. If you want to industrialize a country and you want economic growth, you need access to cheap power. That's the basic ideology, right? So there should be no debate about whether or not we need access to cheap power. In fact, even if you study how the apartheid, the construct of the apartheid system built the economy then, the reason Eskom was as subsidized as it was precisely because you wanted to drive economic activity. South Africa's issue has not only been that Eskom has become more inefficient and more expensive, it's also that we de-industrialized our economy. So even at the exit price of a kilowatt of power, it goes into an economy that is less industrialized, more service-based, and then therefore doesn't achieve the economic multiplier that you need it to. So the input has to be, you need cheap power. That's the input. And whatever side of the economic debate you sit on, that's the single thing we all have to agree to.
Sure, Lukhanyo.
I think just quickly, Tatim, on Eskom, yes, you need to deal with the question of the debt. We know that our debt at Eskom is mainly on the generation arm of the business, and we have not yielded a return on investment because Kusile and Medupi, with all the construction defects that happened there, it's taking us much more time to undo those. Boilers have to be repaired time and again because they are leaking. And I think really a radical step. We also know who are the biggest consumers of electricity, partly the mining sector. Long time ago, Tatim, the guys in Mpumalanga who are in the coal mining sector wanted to go off grid, and they proposed to government that they want to build their own stations to electrify their operations. And that would have freed up significant space on our grid so that other new players and new industries can come in. There will never be industrialization, new players in the economy without, say, secure and, of course, affordable electricity. And I think it's time that we allow those who can, particularly in the mining industry, to go off grid. And I think we need to shut down between Kusile and Medupi. One of those stations just needs to be shut down, and we just cut our losses with it, because it's going to be such a nightmare to keep it going if we insist on keeping them in business.
And of course, the world is changing. I mean, in the next 10 or so years, within that period of time, most of the world would have gone off the fossil-fired type power generation.
Absolutely.
Pama Nundan says, is cutting the wage bill not counterproductive? The economy needs to be stimulated to increase consumer spend to support failing businesses. And Zanet Sali says, if we are to turn economies around, we need to start at the grassroots level. Conversation needs to change from spaza owners, taxi drivers, all the way through executive corporate managers and those and politicians in power. How do we bring these communities together? Because they seem to be talking from different scripts as matters stand. Brian Mason, we should look at the Singaporean model. One of the projects that they embraced is to provide housing. However, the housing is not provided for free. People accept the value of the house, and through their own personal means test determine what they can pay over a 20-year period. And why can't we do things the same way? And Cecilia Wedgwood suggests that employees should be given shares in their companies so that not only a small number of individuals grow very rich at the expense of everybody else within their companies. Let's come back to the recovery plan now as we conclude. I want to understand from you that, and Vusi did refer to this point in his remarks as well, that we do not seem as South Africa to be having a coherent vision of what kind of South Africa do we want, economically speaking. We seem to be moving from one crisis to the next. And as I'm talking to you, I can tell you I've got 15, 20 different questions to ask. And I realize that we're not going to go anywhere if we're talking about one unified plan for South Africa. What kind of economic system do we want for South Africa, and what type of society do we want to be, economically speaking? I think we should start there. And my question, therefore, is, with the recovery plan, are we going to see that vision articulated? And are we going to see the willingness on the part of the politicians, the government, to support that vision so that it can be lived by ordinary people, by entrepreneurs, by aspiring people? This question I'm asking for the benefit of young South Africans, because that vision is the kind of thing that will make young South Africans understand that this is the country they should help in building. As matters stand, we move from railways that are now not working, public infrastructure, this, that, and the other. Busi, once again, it's your chance. Coherent vision for South Africa, and how do we achieve it?
So I think you said me. So I'll give you three very quick things. The first is that one of the early and quick wins that we don't talk about is how far we could go if we just liberalized our credit markets, particularly credit capital markets. So these are the rules that the providers of capital and credit use when they advance credit to households, SMEs, and businesses. If we took a real hard look at those credit scoring systems and whether or not those rules were prohibitive and restrictive, I think we could free up significant capital to come into the real economy. I want to be very clear. What you need here is growth in the real economy, where real people earn real wages and pay real pensions and have real savings. That's what you need, right? And so you need money going into the real economy. So that's the first thing. The second, and I remember asking this question to the president exactly 3 years ago, directly to his face. It might even be 2 years ago. We need to relook at Regulation 28. Now, I work in the alternative asset classes. We've been talking about the relook at Regulation 28 forever. But you need to relook at Regulation 28 and how much money, as well as allowances, local pension funds are incentivized to drive into the real economy in South Africa. What happens right now, Tim, is you and I, as employees and laborers, are putting our money into pension funds in South Africa, and they're taking that money and investing it offshore in offshore companies because they're managing risk. But as a consequence of that, if the money doesn't circulate back into our own internal economy, we can't drive down the cost of capital because pension funds provide long-term capital. So you can't drive down the cost of capital, which means you can't drive enterprise and economic activity. This is why you have entrepreneurs going, where is the money? We are dry of money to start.
And we're talking about what, over 6 trillion rands or so, I hear.
It's a ridiculous sum of money.
And right money now, that's been put in the system by the South Africans themselves. It's not coming back into the economic system. Let's pause right there. And Lukhanyo, let me hear your brief views on the kind of South Africa you think we should be working towards, economically speaking. And hopefully we can see signs of,
I think the first is just to say the economic recovery plan will not give us that coherent vision, unfortunately, because that coherent vision will also have to talk to what is our comparative and competitive advantage just across the world, and where do we see ourselves within the geopolitical political economy of the world, and what is it that we can provide the world. I mean, I hear somebody was talking about Singapore. Singapore defined its niche and it explored its niche and it has been pursuing its niche. You can go around all these countries like your South Koreas and so on that have over time managed to come out of economic ruin into a very good path that is sustainable, works for the people, and creates great returns for livelihoods and sustenance of those livelihoods for people, and for people to be in employment and be able to do all of these other things that Busi is talking to, pensions and savings. So I don't think we are going to get that, unfortunately, today from that. But I do think that for any recovery to happen, we need to go back to basics and press on to make sure that government does the right things. And part of that is just to demand more accountability and transparency in the system, because I think the system has been allowed for far too long to be ran as a bureaucracy that is quite secretive. In some instances, there are attempts for accountability, but it's almost usually just malicious compliance with the demands for accountability. So I think civil society is going to need to press on very hard for greater transparency, for making sure that in real time we can hold those who are in power accountable for the things that they say they're going to.
I'm interrupting you there because we are now about to close. And Busi, Sibeko, your brief comments.
Yes, just to pick up from those comments, I agree fully. I think participation and transformation are key. And in thinking about the presentation that will be made, we have to ask ourselves to what extent participation and transparency have been taken seriously to develop that collective goal. I think really for me, the ultimate question is, what does a social democracy look like? What kind of economy does a social democracy, which is what we're told would have, look like? And I'd argue that the current neoliberal economic policies that we're implementing will not get us to that goal, no matter whether we all buy into it or not. I think that is the working goal that we can build off of, to say what kind of economic policies do we need to achieve a social democracy.
Sure. Well, for me personally, the fact that more than 54% of people in the age cohort 15 to 35 are not employed says a lot about the type of society that we are, because you know, these are the custodians of South Africa going forward. You know, and if they've been excluded in this manner, I can just imagine the kind of South Africa we're going to end up with. And the fact that we've got so many people dependent on social grants and not employment where they can earn incomes for themselves is another story. So so-called good quality life and the infrastructure we spoke about, the fact that people do not have access to water that should have been provided anyway and has been budgeted for, says a lot about the type of society that we are. So we hope that the transparency, accountability that Lukhanyo spoke about will come about. The reforms that you are suggesting, Vusi, will happen. We know might not happen. And Busi, that somehow will find the resources to make sure that the social relief programs that you believe will improve quality of life can be funded, that we find such resources. But we don't know. We'll see. Let's wait until this afternoon. I'd like to thank you for having been my panelists on this webinar. And one takeaway for me is that I think I get a sense that we need a coherent vision for the kind of South Africa we want, economically speaking. And I get a sense that we have not really spoken about that as a nation. We just seem to be moving from one crisis to another, one situation, one blunder. And that's why it's an improvisational situation. You know, different actors come in and put in their interests and then direct the focus elsewhere. I thank you very much for having been my panelists. And the attendees, thank you too for posting your questions as well as participating in this engagement. Have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure, appreciate it. Thank you.